Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on another of our Safer at Home series on a sultry day in Falmouth. Hopefully everybody's in air conditioning because summer has arrived on the Cape. A couple different things. Probably you guys are all veterans now. You know the rules. But if you've got a question down at the bottom, there's a chat feature. So type it in down there. If you would, make sure you mute yourself. But we like seeing you, so you can leave your picture on if you like, or you can turn it off if you like. All our lectures are brought to you by through the courtesy of Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, of Martha's Vineyard Savings, and also we want to give a shout out to our friends over at Eight Cousins Bookseller because they have copies of all the books. And I want to welcome today our guest, Thurston Clarke, who's the author of 13 books, I believe, Mr. Clarke, right? He's an American historian, journalist. Yeah. And this is a topic that I, as an historian, and everybody who knows me knows I love military history, but in many ways, talking about Vietnam, this is the electrified third rail. We know that lots and lots of books are written about World War II. People, still don't seem to wrap their arms around something like Korea, but Vietnam seems to elicit a lot of emotions. So it's and you talk about in this book the leadership of some people that we have heard of, and one we probably haven't heard of. Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon, but also a guy named Graham Martin, who's the U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam. So. Let me start by asking, why did you choose this subject?
Well, first of all, I think it's for the United States, one of the only really good news stories out of Vietnam. I mean, that may be a strange thing to say about the last 6 weeks of a war that we were on the losing side of. But at the same time, I was struck by the fact that 130,000 South Vietnamese were evacuated from their country in 6 weeks. They were all flown to the United States, where they were processed through resettlement camps and given American citizenship. It's an extraordinary act of humanitarian grace after a contentious and difficult war for the United States. And I'll tell you what first put me on it. A very good friend I live up in the Adirondacks, up in upstate New York, and a high school classmate of my daughter's went into the Army after graduating from college as an intelligence officer. And he was posted to Afghanistan. And after he came back, he was telling me how hard it was to get visas for his translator and some of his fixers and facilitators who had risked their lives and those of their families to get to the United States. And so when I heard this story, it kind of reminded me of that famous photograph of the helicopter taking off from a roof in Saigon, which was pretty much all I knew about the last days of the Vietnam War and our evacuation. And of course, that helicopter image is very famous and very iconic. So I looked into the picture a bit more, and I found that almost everything I had assumed about that photograph was wrong. I'd assumed, as a lot of people still do, that it was taken on the roof of the American embassy. And I assumed that most of the people in the helicopter were Americans, a few Vietnamese. And that it was a U.S. military helicopter. Instead, I found out that it was actually taking off from the roof of an apartment building in downtown Saigon, and that the roof was one of 10 or 12 roofs that had been prepared for just this kind of an evacuation. And the people on the staircase who were climbing the stairs to the helicopter were all Vietnamese, most of them Vietnamese civilians. The pilot of the helicopter was a civilian who was working for Air America, which is the proprietary airline of the CIA. It was not run directly by the CIA, but it was owned through various dodges by the CIA. And then I found out more about the pilot and about the man in the white shirt who's leaning down to help one of the Vietnamese people into the helicopter. And it turned out that he was a man named Orrin Hardage, and famous for being a hard-drinking, kind of good old boy in Saigon. He lost an eye in Okinawa, in the Battle of Okinawa during World War II. He had a patch over his eye. Well, he almost lost his eye, but he had a piece of shrapnel in it. And he didn't know the people that he was rescuing, but he felt that it was his duty that you leave your allies on the battlefield, even if they're civilian allies. And when he packed these people into the helicopter, in order to take 2 or 3 more strangers, he himself rode on the skids of the helicopter from the roof of the building to Tan Son Nhut Air Base, where the people were put in a larger helicopter to be taken out to the fleet, American fleet. And he stood on the skids holding a Swedish submachine gun in one hand. And he had one of the Vietnamese passengers grab his other arm because he was afraid there was a lot of ground fire, either from the North Vietnamese or from angry South Vietnamese troops who felt they were being abandoned. And if he was hit, he didn't want to fall to his death. So what I had originally thought was a photograph showing a great moment of American shame was actually a moment showing, it was a photograph showing a great moment of heroism. And that really started me off on my interviews with the Americans. Several of the Vietnamese referred to them as American Schindlers and American Wallenbergs, comparing them to righteous Gentiles who had rescued Jews during the Holocaust. And in fact, some of these Americans did risk their lives and their careers because for much of the 6 weeks prior to the end of the war, the official US policy was not to take these Vietnamese civilians out. And in fact, the US Congress and congressmen, many congressmen, particularly anti-war congressmen, were very much against it. So that's how I kind of launched into this. And then I started interviewing people. And I found that there was essentially what I call a kind of uncoordinated mutiny on the part of a number of American diplomats, Central Intelligence officers, military people, civilians in Vietnam, to defy the official policy of the Pentagon and the US government at the time and get their Vietnamese out on what amounted to a kind of underground railway. And in the final days of the week of the war, finally the Ford administration played catch up and legitimized what they'd been doing and brought out tens of thousands of more Vietnamese.
So your story focuses pretty much on the last 6 to 8 weeks of the war, correct? You focus on the whole war. You focus on March, April '75, correct?
Yes, I focus. The real focus is on open book, more or less, with the first great North Vietnamese offensive in early January, and I take it through the end of April in 1975.
What's going on? What's the situation in Vietnam at the time, and who are some of these leaders you were referencing? I think I might have mentioned them a couple at the top of our talk, but lay the groundwork. What's happening in Vietnam at this moment?
Well, what had happened is 2 years earlier, the United States and South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the communist organization, we call it the Viet Cong, in South Vietnam, the communists, all signed an agreement, Paris Peace Accords. And as part of the accords, the United States agreed to remove all but 50 uniformed military personnel from South Vietnam. And this was in 1973, and we did so. And in exchange, the North Vietnamese released the American prisoners of war who had been held in Hanoi. That's how John McCain got out and others. At the same time, however, the North Vietnamese army, which occupied sections of South Vietnam, particularly in the central and northern highlands, was allowed to keep roughly about 100,000 troops of its troops in South Vietnam. And so for the next almost 2 years, there was a kind of low-grade war going on between the North Vietnamese forces and the South Vietnamese army. American military was not involved anymore. As I said, we only had 50 uniformed personnel there. And at the beginning of 1975, the North Vietnamese launched an attack on a provincial capital about 60 miles from Saigon that they took. And then in March, there was an all-out offensive in the Central Highlands and also against Da Nang. And the South Vietnamese army collapsed and evacuated and fled from their positions in northern South Vietnam and the central part of the country, fled towards Saigon. And there were hundreds of thousands of refugees from these provinces that headed south, and it was a catastrophe. And it was at this point that slowly Americans in Saigon began putting at risk South Vietnamese on the transport planes that were flying equipment and supplies in for the South Vietnamese army into Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon, and going back empty to the Philippines. Instead, in Guam, these planes began to arrive with dozens and then several hundreds South Vietnamese refugees who had no papers, no visas for the United States whatsoever. This caused a bit of a flap, and there were protests lodged by the Philippine government. And the U.S. Ambassador, Graham Martin, tried to put an end to it, but actually the military attaché, Brigadier General Homer Smith, who was at Tan Son Nhut, was half an hour away or so, 20 minutes away from the embassy, and he more or less looked the other way. And we had another problem too in these early days, which was that we had about 7,000 Americans, citizens, were living in South Vietnam. Many of them were contractors. Some were soldiers who had stayed after the war. Many of them had South Vietnamese wives and girlfriends and families. And they refused to leave without their families. And Homer Smith and the Pentagon in Washington and the Ford government was particularly the senators and congressmen were urging the United States to get these Americans out. Well, there was no way to force them out except at the point of a gun barrel to get rid of them, to get them to get on planes and leave. And there were a number of meetings held with the representatives and with these contractors and Americans. And finally, they were told that, yes, they could take their wives and children out. And one of the Americans, when he heard this, said famously to the army briefer, "What is it that you don't understand about families?" And families, of course, in Vietnam include nieces and nephews and cousins and in-laws and on and on and on. So the average Vietnamese family would be 30, 40 people or so. And so the Americans, a lot of them dug their heels in, and they said they wouldn't leave unless they could take the whole Vietnamese families out. And so what happened next was that General Smith figured out a way to do this, and he composed and got Graham Martin to sign off on it, a letter of support, an affidavit of support, in which any American resident in South Vietnam could list the family members that he wanted to take out. And you take this piece of paper, this affidavit, you'd sign it, you take it to Sonsonate with your family members. It would be processed and stamped, and you'd get on a plane. Now, what happened pretty quickly was that a number of Americans who wanted to get out people who were unrelated to them, who they thought were at risk, filled in 10, 20, 30 of their so-called adopted children. And they just claimed that they'd adopted all these Vietnamese. I mean, a 30-year-old American would claim that he'd adopted a 50-year-old Vietnamese woman, and so on and so on. And it was clearly not true. However, the American diplomat, Ken Moorfield, who was then in charge of processing the affidavits and providing visas for Vietnamese, had set up a branch of the consulate at Sonsonate Airport. And he simply stamped the things and let people go, as did a lot of the other diplomats and military who were there, because they didn't want to stand in the way of these people escaping. And I asked Ken, and I asked a lot of the Americans who took part in this underground railroad, why did you do this? Why did you, stretch the law? Why did you take this risk? I mean, they were endangering their careers. Why did you do this? And again, they said to me, I don't think I could have lived with myself. 10 or 20 years later, I would have still seen the faces of the people that I left behind. So there was that. And again, I heard that as the main motivation that people had for taking part in this. And a number of Vietnamese kept in touch with their American rescuers for years and years after the war. So there was this feeling of trying to avoid what they thought would be a great amount of guilt on their part if they just got on the plane and left these people behind. To illustrate that a bit more, there were two American Foreign Service officers who had served in Vietnam various times, Lionel Rosenblatt and Craig Johnstone. And they were both in the State Department in Washington when Saigon was clearly going to fall. And so they asked permission to go there, and they were told they couldn't go. That it was forbidden for any American diplomats or official personnel to go, because the theory was they were just going to have to be evacuated the next day, and they didn't want all of these extra Americans there. So Rosenblatt and Johnstone, they simply went AWOL. They bought their own air tickets to Saigon. They left their jobs without permission. They flew in on the last scheduled Pan Am plane. They found a safe house in downtown Saigon. They began meeting. They wore disguises because the State Department had cabled the embassy to find them and arrest them and deport them immediately. And so State Department security personnel were looking for them. So they had to avoid the other Americans. They met people very cloak and dagger in the post office, in the cathedral. They stashed them in the safe house, and then they organized their transport to the airport and had to smuggle them onto the airport with forged papers, and left 2 or 3 days later, having probably gotten 500 people, people they knew, and family members of people they knew, and gotten them out of the country. And so when they got back to Washington, And about a week after Saigon fell, there was a story about their exploits in the Washington Post. And Kissinger read it, and as did Lawrence Eagleburger, who was his assistant. And Eagleburger called them onto the carpet to get a dressing down from Kissinger. And so they went in to see it, to see Kissinger with Eagleburger. And Kissinger said to them, you know, you did something, you know, very illegal. I'm trying to have a disciplined State Department. You guys just went off on your own, and you got all these people out. And then he stopped and he said, and if more people had acted as you did, we would have had a much more honorable departure from Vietnam. He said, you did the right thing. And then he turned to Eagleburger and he said, if you bring anything, a case like this again before me, it'll be you who's going to be in trouble and not them. And then after that, Kissinger asked them where they would each like to serve next. And they each gave their kind of dream postings. And he turned to Eagleburger and he said, make it happen. So you see, Kissinger was in a funny position. Kissinger had won the Pulitzer Prize. Not Pulitzer, I'm sorry, the Nobel Peace Prize with his North Vietnamese counterpart in 1973. And in fact, when the wheels began to come off South Vietnam at first, he proposed to Ford, he said to Ford that he was thinking of repaying the money from his Nobel Peace Prize and returning it. In the end, he didn't do that. But in the final couple of days, Kissinger was more of an ally of the people who were trying to evacuate Americans. More an ally of the Americans who were trying to evacuate South Vietnamese than he was of Graham Martin and of the hardliners in the Pentagon, and particularly of the hardliners in Congress, in the Senate. The biggest barrier to a larger and more successful evacuation was the antipathy of the American people as represented by their Congress, to having a huge number of Vietnamese refugees in the United States. We were sick of Vietnam. There was a certain amount of racism involved. We had 9% unemployment. It was a difficult time. The last thing people wanted was a couple of 100,000 Vietnamese on their doorstep, which is in the end exactly, we got 130,000 Vietnamese. So it took a certain amount of courage for Ford, which Ford did do, to stand up to Congress and to say, and to push through after the evacuation had happened, money for the resettlement of the refugees.
You touched on some names that we've heard of, you know, Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger, him mentioned Nixon, but he's obviously involved, and Graham Martin. How would you describe, how would you characterize the leadership, you know, from Washington and, you know, and obviously in South Vietnam as well, because I think Martin's the ambassador. And was it basically, you know, first of all, that's one question. And then you just touched on something too. Is that why it was so unusual about the evacuation of the South Vietnamese? These are ostensibly our allies, and yet it doesn't seem to be met with this universal approval. Is it just essentially racism, or
No.
So
Yeah,
two questions in one there, I guess.
Yeah, there was certainly a certain amount of racial animus, and there was also a feeling, particularly in the anti-war movement, that the South Vietnamese were unworthy of being rescued. That there was, the narrative was that the South Vietnamese government was corrupt and vicious and inefficient and didn't deserve our monetary support or military support, and particularly President Chu. So there was that feeling. And for example, the public opinion polls showed the American people really against having refugees. There was a question asked in April I think it was a Gallup poll that said if you thought more aid, first of all, the first question was, should we accept refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia? And overwhelmingly, I think, kind of 60%, 70% people said no. And then they said, well, should we supply them with more arms and aid and assistance if that would prevent a bloodbath in the event of a communist victory? And still, the majority of American people said no. There was an incredible callousness towards the South Vietnamese late in the final years of the war, particularly after the Paris Peace Accords, when Americans felt that we had washed our hands of it. George McGovern, who had run for president in 1972 and was a senator, after the evacuation had happened, he recommended sending the Vietnamese refugees back. And he said that 90% of them should be sent back, and that they wouldn't suffer at all if they were returned. This is, of course, at a time when 2 weeks before there was a bloodbath going on in Cambodia. And there were a lot of other, particularly anti-war senators, who were very much opposed to what Ford did. Anyway, I got off on a tangent there. You did ask about Graham Martin, who was one of the more fascinating characters. Was the American ambassador at the time. He'd come in 73. He'd had a storied, famous diplomatic, very good diplomatic career. He had been ambassador to Thailand, and then ambassador to Italy, ambassador to Rome, and had planned to retire. And Kissinger leaned on him, as did Ford and Alexander Haig, to take not Ford, but Haig, Ford came later, to take the position. And Martin said no several times and resisted, and finally they appealed to his patriotism, and Martin agreed to go. Martin was a kind of interesting guy. He was a hardline cold warrior, but he was also a Democrat who's one of his two heroes was Adlai Stevenson. And the way he got his position in Rome is give you a good example of how Machiavellian Martin was. He was known to be a real schemer and a backstabber. Anyway, when he was ambassador to Bangkok, Hubert Humphrey came, and on a delegation of businessmen and attorneys, and among them was Richard Nixon. And there was a dinner party at the Royal Palace, and it came time to give a toast. And Vice President Humphrey began to get up to give the toast. And Martin put his hand on his arm and said, no. He said, I am President Johnson's representative here, and therefore I am supposed to be the one who gives the toast. I am the senior government official. And so Martin stood up and gave the toast. And afterwards, he turned to Humphrey and to Nixon within Nixon's hearing. And he said to Humphrey, if you ever become president, I hope you realize that I will, guard your prerogative and your position in the same way I have guarded Vice President Johnson's by being the one as his representative to give the toast. Nixon never forgot this, and after Nixon was elected in 1968, one of his transition people called out of the blue, called Martin and said, the President Nixon elect Nixon would like to give you a diplomatic post. Where would you like to be ambassador? And Martin said, Rome. And there was a long silence and said, well, that's, but usually it's a post that goes to friend of the president, a contributor. Can you think of anything else? And Martin said, Rome again. And he got it. So this is the kind of man he was. One other story about when he was in Thailand, he was recalled from Bangkok because he refused to endorse the Johnson administration's efforts to have American combat troops enter Thailand to help the Thai army battle the communists on the border with Cambodia. And he refused. He sent really bitter telegrams back to Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Robert McNamara at the Pentagon. And as a result, Rusk recalled him and gave him a kind of do-nothing job in Washington, and he was finally saved by Nixon coming into power. So he was a very headstrong. He was a schemer. He was someone who believed that, as he put it once, I know more about Vietnam in this country than anyone else in the American government, which was not true. So he was also invested in the war because his adopted son had been killed in action in 1965 as a helicopter pilot. He kept a large photograph of this adopted son. The son was the son of his wife's brother, who had been murdered in a robbery, and they had adopted him, and he'd been killed in this helicopter accident. So for Graham Martin to lose the Vietnam War was almost unthinkable. And it's one reason why almost until the end, he believed, as did Kissinger and others, that there would be a negotiated settlement and that the North Vietnamese army would stop at the gates to Saigon and would not enter it, and would then negotiate a power sharing agreement with the current South Vietnamese government, which of course didn't happen and was never the intention. But the North Vietnamese, with the help of the Russians, kind of hoodwinked Ford and Kissinger, so that up until about a day before the end, they and Graham Martin didn't think that Saigon was going to be invaded. And therefore, if you believe that, as Martin did, there was no reason to evacuate all these South Vietnamese, because there would be plenty of time to evacuate them. And in fact, one of the stories I tell in the book is about 3 days before the end, the head, Tom Glenn, the head of the National Security Agency, NSA, station in South Vietnam, went to see the CIA station chief, Polgar, and he told Polgar, he said, "This is over. You're crazy. You guys have got to get out of here. All of my signals and my intelligence tells me that the North Vietnamese are going to come barreling right into the downtown Saigon in 2 or 3 days." And he first told Graham Martin this, and Graham Martin led him to the door, put his arm around him, and he said, "Young man, when you're older, and when you get to be older and more seasoned as I am, you'll understand these things better, but I can tell you that the communists have no intention of marching into Saigon." So after hearing that, Glenn went down the hall to Polgar's, the CIA station chief's office, Polgar, and he said, gave him the same news. And Polgar looked at him and laughed, and he said, "I'll bet you a bottle of champagne, you can choose the vintage, that we'll all be here in the embassy this time next year." And of course, 2 days later, the helicopters were pulling Polgar and Graham Martin and others out of the embassy.
So it's decided to get some of these South Vietnamese out of their own country. Explain how did it work? What was the mechanics of this operation?
Yeah.
Was it consistent over the course of your book? How did it work?
No, not at all. What happened was that in the early days in April, there were these South Vietnamese being put on illegally, put on these planes leaving from Tan Son Nhut. Finally, in the last 7 or 8 days, the people in Washington who wanted to evacuate the South Vietnamese persuaded Ford and Kissinger that a lot of them, there were already kind of 10,000 Vietnamese in the Philippines, and these people were going to get out. And so then they gave them parole, immigration parole, and they started sending in planes to pick up people who had this parole. Now, I mentioned the family members of the contractors, which was, thousands. So, for example, the 21st of April, there were 1,000 or 2,000 refugees leaving. 3 or 4 days later, there were 6, 7, 8,000 a day, and there was a steady air bridge of these planes. But even more, not even more, got out also, a lot got out by ships. And what happened, there were a number of smaller ships. The Vietnamese got on fishing boats and everything and got out to the American fleet, where they were taken on board, even though the American fleet had the sailors had no specific orders to rescue them. But about a week before the end, the Pentagon sent Richard Armitage, who was had been a Navy officer in Vietnam. He'd had 5 or 6 tours of duty. He spoke fluent Vietnamese, and he had very close connections with the Vietnamese Navy. And he had resigned from the Navy in disgust because he realized that the Paris Peace Accords were going to be a betrayal of the South Vietnamese, of the army, of the military. Anyway, there was worry in the Pentagon, of course, by particularly Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, that the South Vietnamese Navy was going to fall into the hands of the North. And so to prevent this happening, they sent Armitage to Saigon the week before the end. Armitage went and he met with the Chief of Naval Operations, Do Kim, who was a friend of his. And he explained that the United States would send a destroyer to rendezvous with the South Vietnamese fleet off of South Vietnam and escort the ships to safety. And at that point, Kim looked at him and he said, well, of course, that my sailors are not going to leave without their families. And they'll have to take them. And Armitage just stared at him, and he didn't, as Kim later said, that he didn't say yes and he didn't say no. And Armitage knew what he was doing and what was going to happen. And so at the end of the day, when finally on the last day of the war, 30 South Vietnamese Navy ships left the port in Saigon, Newport it was called. And on board were 30,000 Vietnamese refugees. Not just the families of the sailors, but friends and people who'd been able to get on these ships. So these ships brought out, courtesy, thanks to Armitage, 30,000 Vietnamese men, women, and children. And they rendezvoused with the American destroyer and then headed for the Philippines. Now, the problem was that South Vietnam had fallen to the north, and under international law, these ships now supposedly belonged to the North Vietnamese Navy, spoils of war. So, and the Philippine government had said they wouldn't allow them to dock. So what Armitage did with the connivance of the military, the captain of the destroyer, they sent officers, American officers, onto all of the South Vietnamese ships. And they painted over, they had their numbers painted over and painted them with US Navy numbers. They had a ceremony on all these ships. They lowered the South Vietnamese flag and they raised the Stars and Stripes. And suddenly all of these 30 ships became part of the American US Navy and were allowed to dock in the Philippines and disembark 30,000 people who then became American citizens.
Obviously, given what's going on in the world right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're seeing the Black Lives Matter issue. We're still fighting overseas in Afghanistan. Everything that's happened and what's going on. In your opinion, why is this story timely now? How can this appeal to all of us?
It's an immigration story, first of all. It's a story of how 130,000 people were taken into the United States and given citizenship. Had that happen in a very short period of time. Now we hardly take any refugees whatsoever. So it's a story of generosity, of American generosity toward refugees, endangered refugees whose lives are in danger. So I think that makes it very current. And also there's the Afghanistan story. The question is, what's going to happen if the Taliban returns to power or some kind of power sharing? What's going to happen to the Afghans who've thrown their lot in with us? They're going to be in a lot worse trouble even than the Vietnamese are, because there is even less appetite in this country now to take large numbers of refugees. And they don't have an easy way to get out. You have to remember that in South Vietnam, these people had to go by plane and ship. They couldn't go into Cambodia, into the arms of the Khmer Rouge. They couldn't go north into Laos, and they couldn't go to North Vietnam, obviously. The only way to go was out by ship and by plane, American ships and planes. Whereas in Afghanistan, they can cross into Pakistan, which a lot of them have done. So we're not going to be, we're going to have a similar dilemma, but I'm not so sure it's going to have such a happy ending. It used to be that a lot of people were talking, a few years ago when they were talking about a peace agreement with the Taliban, about a helicopter from the rooftop moment, which is not impossible. That if there's a takeover from the Taliban, a slow takeover, a fast takeover, that you're going to see American diplomats and American personnel evacuated from Kabul. So I think comparing it to having this as context for what may or may not happen in Afghanistan is timely. But it also tells us how we as a nation have changed in our attitude to refugees. Even though the American people overwhelmingly at the time didn't want the South Vietnamese, once they were here, public opinion changed very quickly within about 6 months. And it was largely Jerry Ford who did that, who gave a number of strong speeches about how this is the American tradition to welcome refugees, that we don't leave people who've allied themselves with us behind. And the country eventually got behind him and more or less welcomed these people. Compare that to the situation we have today. It couldn't be more dissimilar. And I think it's not just, I think it's you have to remember the context. Even though in 1975, we were in a recession and there was a lot of unemployment, Americans then had grown up welcoming refugees from, particularly refugees from communism. We had welcomed the Hungarian refugees, the Cubans. We had the World War II. We had taken refugees after the war. So there was the people who were then living in the United States in 1975 had grown up believing that taking refugees was a noble thing to do and very much part of the American tradition. Now, 45 years later, we've had new generations who don't have that same experience and don't have that same feeling about refugees. And of course, a lot of it was the Cold War, and the Cold War has been over, so we haven't had Cold War refugees.
I want to remind people that if you got a question, type it down in the chat part of our on the box on below. As we start to wind down here, another two-part question: were there a couple were there characters that you really liked or didn't like as you're doing this research? Like as you're writing about this one or that one, you really got to
Yeah.
you really grew a fondness for this one or really unfondness for that one. And second part,
Most of the people that I interviewed were heroes, and I was very fond of them, particularly Ken Moorfield, who was the one who processed people with the affidavits. There were so many. There was one man, Bill Bell, who was a translator, sergeant, who was part of the American delegation. It's kind of complicated, but there were Americans who were there to liaison with the communists, with the North Vietnamese and the communists and South Vietnamese, to look for MIAs. And Bill Bell, when the end was coming down, there was this horrific plane crash, and there were a lot of South Vietnamese orphans who were being brought to the United States on an Air Force plane that crashed, and there were a number of Americans on it as well. His wife and both his children were on the plane, and his wife and son were killed, and his young daughter was badly injured. And he flew back to California to be with his daughter, but then after a couple of days he returned. And he said that he felt a moral obligation to return because he knew Vietnam, he could speak the language, and he could see what was going to happen, and he wanted to help the Vietnamese people as much as he could get out. And he did. In the final days, saw him racing around in a car and picking up Vietnamese who he knew and bringing them to Tons and Newt and smuggling them past the police at the gate. And he became an expert in MIA and POW affairs for the next 20 years. And it turned out was the first official American to go to Hanoi I think it was in the early 1990s, when to open an American office there to investigate POW MIA affairs. So there were dozens of stories like his, and they're in the book. But I became a lot of fond of many of these people. Even the villains, the people who were, mistaken and made mistakes, like Graham Martin, in the final hours of the evacuation, Martin refused to leave. He was being pressured to leave, and they wanted to stop sending helicopters when there were still more than 1,000 people at the American embassy needing evacuation. And Martin just said, pushed back, and another 600 got out because he refused to leave. He finally was ordered by Ford to leave, which he did. Anyway, I'm getting a bit hoarse, I think. I think I'm going to have to call a halt here.
Oh, okay. One more question too, and with the people that you've interviewed, has anyone not wanted to speak about what happened during the time?
There was only one person. I interviewed 50, 60 people at least. There was only one person who was an American Foreign Service officer who had been in Da Nang and had been very traumatized by what had happened, by leaving behind a lot of the consulate personnel in Da Nang. And he resigned from the State Department shortly afterwards and had another career and didn't want to revisit it, but that was it.
The name of your book is Honorable Exit. As we wind this down, would you say that but considering that Americans tend to look upon Vietnam with embarrassment, or they're not quite sure how to take it. Let's leave it with that. Did we end on a high note? Did we do something we should be proud of?
I think the high note came for us when these 130,000 Vietnamese became American citizens and became one of the most productive and successful refugee and immigrant groups that we've assimilated into the fabric of our country. I think that's the high point. Well,
I want you to save your pipes here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I don't know if it's warm by you. It's warm by us. So I hope again everyone stayed in air conditioning. So thank you everyone for joining us. Good luck with this book. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, and it's been a great pleasure.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.